Since I will no longer be publishing in Real Paranormal Magazine, I went ahead and released all four of the papers that I had written about Mathew Franklin Whittier's four primary plagiarists, which is to say Charles Dickens, Edgar Allan Poe, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Margaret Fuller. So all of those papers are available. If you go to my website and go to the articles tab on the left in the navigation bar, you can get to them quite easily. I've announced them to a few people. The Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, there weren't very many people to write to, but I have done that. But just today I realized that I left out a piece of evidence concerning Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And partly I left it out because the pseudonym is a little difficult to prove for Mathew's pen. But I'm going to go over that today. I'm going to try to be as quick as I can. I realize some of these are getting too long. And I'm going to try to get through the background very quickly and get into the meat of this thing. The gist of this is that Mathew could be very sarcastic. He really was a good satirist, but he was a little bit careful. He basically really only unleashed his full satirical powers on people that deserved it. Even Edgar Allan Poe, he really didn't blast as much as he could have. Apparently he felt sorry for him with regard to his abusive childhood that he experienced. But with Margaret Fuller, he let loose, and he let loose on Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And that's what we're going to look at today. I didn't take this pseudonym to be Mathew's at first, although the style looked like Mathew. I was fooled. Basically, I have fooled myself a number of times, which is to say Mathew fooled me quite a number of times because I was trying to be rigorous and I would err on the side of caution, and as a result, I would miss things. So that's what happened here. I figured this out some months ago, but I'd forgotten about it when I wrote the article about Browning. So what we have here is an article, a review in the Portland Transcript signed with Mathew's star in January 31, 1857 in the Portland Transcript. Now this cannot be Margaret Fuller because she died in 1850. Mathew contributed very often throughout most of his career to the Portland Transcript. So when you see the star in the Portland Transcript, I think there's one exception that shows up that's a letter written by a soldier on the front during the Civil War. That's not Mathew, but all the other ones are him. This shows up in January 31, 1857, signed with a star. It's a review of a book of poetry by Julia Ward Howe called Words for the Hour. Now, the backstory to this is apparently Julia Ward Howe and her husband, Dr. Howe, I believe he was, were trying to raise funds for John Brown's raid. Now, Mathew was associated with William Lloyd Garrison. He was aligned with that portion of the abolitionists who believed in moral suasion. Having been raised Quaker, he was against violence unless absolutely necessary. I think he would not have been in favor of John Brown's raid, but he would have known about it. Very likely he would have been aware of this because he was an underground agent for many years under William Lloyd Garrison, as I have extrapolated, a liaison for Garrison. He was deeply involved in the abolitionist movement in the Underground Railroad, as I have just recently shown, and he would have gotten wind of this event coming up. And he would have wanted to defund the Howes as much as possible. They would have published this book, hurriedly slapped it together. That's why they called it Words for the Hour. They would have hurriedly slapped it together to raise funds for John Brown's raid, while Mathew comes in on January 31 and pans it, really forcefully pans it. But his criticism is just because it's crappy poetry. It was just slapped together, and she wasn't much of a poet. So it's justified, but it's pretty edgy. Well, the next week, on February 7, 1857, in the Portland Transcript, comes somebody signing with a dagger, a printer's dagger, like a cross. And this fellow very sarcastically defends Julia Ward Howe. Well, Mathew apparently assumed it was her husband. I don't think it was. I think it was James Freeman Clark, who was a friend of the family. and who ironically ended up presiding over Matthew's funeral, probably arranged by his brother. So I think that galled Matthew. But be that as it may, so the dagger weighs in the next week. The next week, the star sarcastically answers him. But there's another piece that I thought was a third author weighing in. It's signed S. And here in the same edition, the February 14, 1857 edition, is a scathing review of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's recently published poem, Aurora Leigh. That's what we're going to look at. Because on February 28, 1857, the S writes in one more time with an essay entitled Author versus Critic, and it's on this issue of authors versus critics. Clearly it relates to the back and forth between the star and the dagger. And then finally the dagger weighs in and the editor calls a halt to the proceedings, and that's on March 7th, which is the next one. So that's the end of the series, and the dagger gets the last word. But I had an epiphany at some point. I said, wait a minute, Matthew couldn't write again as the star, so he writes as S, which is S for the star, which means that the star and S are the same person, which means that the negative review about Elizabeth Barrett Browning that shows up in the middle of this crossfire is in fact also Matthew. Now we have very strong evidence that Matthew did not like Elizabeth Barrett Browning or her poetry. And this is clinched by a number of clues, which I'm going to go into. This is not absolutely definite. It's clinched in my universe from what I know about Matthew and his writing style and his style of interacting with people and his motives. Remember, I have all of Matthew's motives immediately accessible. This is what I've determined. I don't have his cognitive memories and associations, but I have his emotional memory, and I have all of his motives, because motives go to emotion and intuition. So looking at this, I would say S is definitely Matthew. Now, why didn't it come to me immediately? It did. It actually did, except I fought it off because I wanted to err on the side of caution, so I ignored my own intuition, which, we all do. So there is a mention of Browning in the first initial review of Words for the Hour, and it's a disparaging mention. And until I found out, because I found this out later, until I found out that Elizabeth Barrett Browning had plagiarized 4 of Matthew's poems, and including tributes to his relationship, courtship, and marriage with Abby, I didn't know why he was being so rough on Elizabeth Barrett Browning, because I didn't know anything about her except, the poem that everybody knows about, How Do I Love Thee, Let Me Count the Ways. I didn't know anything about her. But when I found out that she had plagiarized and modified 4 of his poems and possibly 1 of Abby's, then I realized why he's taking this tone. So we're going to look at the 1856-1857 edition of the Portland Transcript. Again, this is archival plastic, but it's not the right kind, so it's kind of slippery. It's the kind you normally would use for newspapers, which I didn't have the other kind in this size. So we're going to look at this first one, and I'm going to read the introduction. Again, his criticism, I think, is quite valid, but he's a little rough. So he says, I didn't have this on. Well, this is going to improve my lighting quite a bit, but it'll also help me see. Every young lady, ere she gets a beau, has a sentimental fever, a sort of mania ascripta, in which she indites tedious epistles to devoted confidants, scribbles rhyme in fearful abundance, and affect the romantic generally. The realities of flirting and marriage gradually dissipate the symptoms, and the would-be poet becomes only a woman. But not all escape thus easily. In some, the fever affects the brain, and the unhappy victim ever after continues in the pitiable delusion that she is a gifted child of song, and that the wretched verses, which she grinds out with so much pain, others will read with as much pleasure, and so she pours out her milk and water effusions to her own intense satisfaction and the utter disgust of everybody else. This seems to be the case with the author of Words for the Hour, a book of poems just published by Ticknor and Fields, containing 165 pages and a great many words, italicized. Why they are particularly suitable for the hour, more than an equal number taken at random from the dictionary, we cannot tell, unless because many of them are new and strange. In other words, she's coined them. Of Mrs. Howe we know nothing except by her book, and judging by that, we should say she is a woman who has mistaken her calling. If she had kept these poems to herself, she might have enjoyed them unmolested, but when she thrusts them on the public and attempts to graft them on our public literature, it becomes the public's business to examine and pass judgment upon them. The whole land is flooded with a tide of silly, hurtful fictions and mamby-pamby poetry, from the feminine mysticism of Mrs. Browning to the verbal folly of Mrs. Howe. It is time the public taste be corrected, and we'll leave it there, because I wanted to get to the point where he mentions Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Well, you get the tone. There may have been something else going on in Matthew's life, but maybe there was a relationship he briefly got into that went sour, and it's hard to say, but this is kind of Matthew at his most satirical. Okay, now I'm going to turn to the Dagger's response in February 7, 1857. Again, this is assumed, I think, by Matthew, based on his comments, to be Julia Ward Howe's husband, Dr. Howe, but I think it is James Freeman Clarke, who I think has been a thorn in Matthew's side for many years, if I'm not mistaken. So I won't read this except maybe just the beginning. Criticism, justly so called, cannot be too highly appreciated. It is to real talent what fire is to gold in the ore, a corrector, a cleanser, and purifier. Every author who knows his own needs is aware of its true value and therefore hails a candid and earnest criticism of his book with gratitude and pleasure, knowing that how much soever it may at the time wound his self-appreciation, it will ultimately tend to his infinite profit and improvement. But for the contemptible, illiberal, dog-in-the-manger attacks with which it has become fashionable to meet every new book, we do most earnestly protest against them. Sometimes these snarling demurs proceed from a whilom scribbler who, having himself perpetrated some trashy volume, is vexed to see it fall flat from the press and nobody stoop to pick it up, and sometimes from some unhappy individual who, feeling himself utterly incapable of producing anything of value, industriously addresses himself with spitefulness proportionate to his envy to ridicule, misconstrue, and mutilate the works of his more fortunate brothers and sisters. And he goes on. That, of course, is how he characterizes Matthew, as all spleen and no substance. And it's totally off target for him. The gist is that he was perhaps unnecessarily acidic, but his criticisms were just. It's a horrible book of poetry, slapped together for the occasion, for the hour, see? So he was absolutely right. And again, at stake here, apparently, is raising funds for John Brown's raid, which, of course, is neither mentioned by neither of them, naturally. So the Star comes in again on February 14, is his response to the Dagger's response. And he says, Macbeth's soliloquy came to our mind at once as we took up the transcript of last week and found a dagger there pointed at our poor meek self. So he says, we had a mingled sensation of horror, wonder, and admiration. Horror that we had made such an exposure of our want of literary taste. Wonder that there was found one man gifted to appreciate Mrs. Howe, and admiration at the sagacity of a sage somebody who said, there could be no folly so great, but there would be some fools to admire it. So Matthew really gets the better of this guy, I would say. But that's me. So then in the same edition comes S. with a critique of Mrs. Browning's new poem, Aurora Leigh. This is signed S, but see, Matthew could not write this review under the star in the same edition as he had written this response to the dagger. So he had to adopt another pseudonym under the circumstances. And that's why he went with S, I believe. I can't absolutely prove it, but this is Matthew's style. And, this is Matthew. I'm absolutely certain of it. He just couldn't write for the same edition of the transcript with the same pseudonym. They wouldn't let him do it. Maybe he tried and they wouldn't let him, or he didn't want to let on that it was the same person. Then in, let's see, what have I said? In the edition of the 28th, S writes one more time and one more time only, and now he addresses this back and forth between the star and the dagger, talking about authors and critics. Well, he specifically mentions this. I don't really want to go into that. I thought it was a third person weighing in. It's not. It's Matthew getting some more licks in. And then finally, in March 7, 1857 edition, the dagger gets the last word. And I don't need to go into that either. I'm just trying to give some background here for the piece that we want to examine. And I'm going to read a fair amount of this. I apologize for the introduction, but I really had to set the stage because we have to establish that this writer is Mathew Franklin Whittier. And that was the only way I knew to do it, was to give the context. So get a sip of water way away from the volume. And we're going to get into this because there are a couple clues in it. So Mrs. Browning has written another long poem, and the literary world is, of course, in raptures over it. The newspapers select their best formularies of laudation. The small reviews have a children's delight about it, and even our friend Putnam, who has not yet added to his other virtues that of being a judge of new books, crows like a chanticleer with the rest. Chanticleer is one of Matthew's favorite words. I'll put on the screen how many times it occurs in the database, how many pieces. This result would doubtless have been the same had Mrs. Browning's book been even considerably poorer than it is, for no one acquainted with the habits of criticism now in vogue would expect anybody but some writer in Blackwood or the Westminster to get at all into the merits of so prolix and pretentious a poem. Matthew liked the word prolix, which just means too long or extended or verbose. I'll put on the screen how many times Matthew has used prolix. It won't be a whole lot, but he did like that word. Aurora Leigh is about as long as the Iliad and is also written in a dialect of English not much easier for common Englishmen to understand than would be the epic Greek. Indeed, we would venture, though the Iliad be all Greek to us, rather to undertake to read it through than to read some passages of Aurora Leigh till we understood them. Mrs. Browning is well known as the writer of a few very beautiful and many very ugly poems. Let me read that again. Mrs. Browning is well known as the writer of a few very beautiful and many very ugly poems. I didn't get this when I first read it, or read it the second time, or the third time, or the fifth time, or the 10th time. I keyed this in and I didn't get it. This is one of Matthew's coded neutral statements. You've seen this before, okay? With regard to Dickens, in his review of Dickens' 1867 readings. We've seen it in Edgar Allan Poe when he talks about the Ultima Thule portrait. And we see it now. This is not praise, which is to say it's praise, but it doesn't say that it's her poem. See? Look. Mrs. Browning is well known as the writer of a few very beautiful and many very ugly poems. She's known as the writer of those beautiful poems, but she isn't. That's as close as Matthew could come in here. That's a little note for anybody who's listening, then or 200 years into the future, however long it took. Okay? I'm not guessing about that. That's one of Matthew's neutral, studied, deliberately neutral statements. Mrs. Browning is well known as the writer of a few very beautiful and many very ugly poems. She is reputed a learned lady, and her choice of language shows indubitable signs of an acquaintance with Greek roots. Her style, from its free use of upper-class words which are not common to the popular expression, are known to the popular heart, but which have the odor of learning, of science, and the philosophies about them, seems always on the verge of being elegantly and studiedly bombastic. And yet it has sometimes contained an expression of quite unusual power or beauty. In her last poem, the excellencies seem to us fewer and the defects altogether more abundant than in any of her preceding publications. In fact, we have not seen a book for a long time which we think contains so much poor reading and which is so little worth the attention of sensible people who value their time as this Aurora Leigh. And then he goes on about the hypocrisy of her claiming in her preface that she considers this her most mature work and she's decided to start writing for herself, and he takes that apart and shows that that's a hypocritical statement. And of course she's writing for the public. She published it in America, for crying out loud, and goes on like that, which I won't go into that. Let me get down a little bit. It would be desirable to know what is the subject of the poem. Yet this, after much study, we are not at all able to announce unless we copy from Mrs. Browning's dedication. The work itself seems to be without subjects, one or more, but on the 8th page we suspect it was intended to be revealed. An old man dies and thus addresses the heroine. His last word was love, love, my child, love, love. Then he had done with grief. Love, my child. Here the word love, repeated 5 times and shrouded in impenetrable mystery as to whether it be noun nominative or verb imperative, seems to be the proposed subject of the poem. Now, I don't know my formal grammar, but I think what he means is this a call to action, love, 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 or is it talking about love as a subject? So this is clearly the same satirical mind that wrote the star-signed review of Julia Ward Howe. He just had to sign it as an S so nobody would know it was the same person. This is the problem when you're dealing with a plagiarist. In this case, he knows it's a plagiarist. He cannot or dare not charge her with plagiarism. He cannot reveal his identity. But by using that deliberately neutral phrase, he can tell posterity, confirm for them that she stole his poems. Also by mentioning that she had written a few that she was considered the author of a few very beautiful and many very ugly poems. But this is what you find with a plagiarist, is that the things that they plagiarized are excellent, and then other things that they've written themselves are awful, like Edgar Allan Poe with The Raven and Eulalame. Eulalame is a very amateurish piece of work, in my opinion. People have raved about it because he's got the reputation, see, so they have to rave about it, just like what Mathew says about the reviews for Aurora Leigh, see. But Eulalame is awful. It's like a 10-year-old's attempt, at poetry for a class or something. And The Raven is brilliant. See, so that's what you get with a plagiarist. And A Christmas Carol is brilliant. And the other Christmas stories that Charles Dickens wrote later are awful, are very pedestrian. They're certainly awful from the spiritual point of view. And with Margaret Fuller, only the pieces that Mathew wrote as the star, again, for the New York Tribune in New York are the ones that people rave about. They don't bother, near as I can tell, nobody talks about the letters that she wrote as the star from Europe. Is that probably, I haven't read them, but I'm guessing they don't compare, see? And that is, again, typical of a plagiarist. Their own work is awful, but the stuff they plagiarize can be pretty good. It's uneven, depending on who they plagiarize from. But if they plagiarize from a particularly good author like Matthew, they're excellent, and they make them famous. These people were not really world-class writers. They were plagiarists who became world-class writers on the strength of the few pieces that they plagiarized from Mathew Franklin Whittier. Now, this is flat-out heresy. I know that, but this is the truth of the matter. And I will continue to say it, but I don't even think that I will insert this particular piece of evidence into my paper. I might. I mean, it's never been published. There's nothing stopping me from doing it. But the problem is that proving that this S is the same as the star and proving that this is Mathew Franklin Whittier is, it's circumstantial. I have to connect a couple dots where I don't have all the dots to connect with, But with my study of Matthew's work, 11-year study of his work, and knowing his motives and knowing who it is, I know this is him blasting Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And I think anybody that studies Matthew's style and looks at the style of the star sign review of Julia Ward Howe and then goes back and reads this S sign review will pretty clearly see that this is the same person writing. I'm going to close with reading this sentence again. Mrs. Browning is well known as the writer of a few very beautiful and many very ugly poems.